everyone, I'm Hannah and I'm a research analyst at AFM.aero. Welcome to the Pilot Training Connect podcast, where we interview individuals from the pilot training industry to learn more about their organization and their views of the industry. Every week, we will invite an industry leader to sit down with us to share their knowledge and views. And this week, I have the great pleasure to be joined by Maximilian Buerger, Managing Director of AFM.aero, to share more information on global trends in terms of demand for airline pilots. Welcome to the Pilot Training Connect podcast, Max.
Thank you for having me, Hannah. You're a great asset to the team. And I know you and I are key research people which research the pilot training industry on a day-by-day basis. So thank you for all your hard work.
Thank you too, Max. Okay, so let's get started. I know that over the past few weeks, we at AFM.aero have been working on a market study to look into the trends of global pilot demand by airlines. What can you share with us on this today?
Yes, Hannah, that is something which we have been doing, and I'm quite excited to share with everyone who is listening. So Hannah, myself, and some others within our team have been working on quite a large study to look at the global developments happening within the aviation industry, specifically the demand for pilots from airlines, as well as in the global pilot training industry, which specifically caters towards servicing those airlines in terms of the demand for pilots. So what I wanted to share with everyone listening today is just a bit of information as part of this larger study that we've done. So the full or most of this information and even more information than what we're sharing today will be uploaded on AFM.aero for all our premium members. But I will share kind of some of the things that we've been working on over the past few weeks with you and with everyone listening today, Hannah. The first thing that we've really done is kind of looked again, okay, what were the forecasts of industry experts in terms of the demand for pilots and how all of it has been affected by the global pandemic. Oliver Wyman, CAVOC from Oliver Wyman is most probably one of the most well-known aviation consultancies in the world. They did a really deep level analysis in, if I'm not mistaken, 2021, which essentially looked at the demand for pilots, for airline pilots, and also the supply side of things. And they published the following data, which is in the pandemic, especially in 2020, kind of the demand for pilots really significantly dropped. As we all know, airlines were laying off pilots. They were sending pilots into early retirement. They were reducing compensation for pilots. And Oliver Wyman put out this information, which essentially showed that the demand for pilots almost halved in 2020, and then they forecasted that this demand would recover by around 2022, which is where we are today, and then continuously increase again. Whereas the supply side of pilots, they projected to be a fairly linear. And based on their analysis, they predicted a pilot shortage starting to emerge, I think, around 2022, 2023, based on the data that they've published, which would then result in a pilot shortage of around 34,000 already by the year 2025. And they also published data in terms of how different regions would experience different levels of a pilot shortage. Now, we as AFM.aero and our research team, we are we are not evaluating the demand for pilots as much, but we are really evaluating and looking at the supply side of kind of training new pilots. So one of the things that we specialize in is we, since 2020, we have mapped out the entire global infrastructure of flight schools and simulator training centers. And we are updating this on a year-by-year basis. And since this year, actually, we're updating this on a day-by-day basis as well. So we have a fairly good idea of how large the global flight training industry is, so how many flight schools there are around the world, how the pandemic has affected the different countries in terms of the size of the flight training industry in those countries. A couple of examples, I know, Hannah, you've been working on this as well, is, for example, Philippines, which has just released the latest data on their approved schools. So going into the pandemic, the Philippines had around 42 flight schools, if I'm not mistaken, 42 or 44. Then during the pandemic, around half of those flight schools got license extensions. So they, because of lockdown, the ability to audit schools was not as easy. And what has happened was it was quite difficult to gain a picture of how much the flight training infrastructure in a particular country has shrunk because of these license extensions for flight schools. But we're starting to see now in the different countries, and I'm using now the Philippines as an example, where now the number of flight schools has gone down from around 42, 44 to 32 approved flight schools. But even out of those 32, a number of them are only running kind of skeleton operations. So we're starting to see more and more on a country by country basis, the reduction in the supply side of training new pilots. And the impact of that will only be seen over the next few years. And I'll touch upon that in a moment. But looking at the data that the leading organizations are putting out there in terms of the pilot demand, right? We've got Oliver Wyman, we've got Boeing, we've got Airbus. We can see the demand for pilots growing again, coming out of this pandemic based on the order books. And then what we've done on top of that as well is we've looked at the supply side, and we as AFM.aero, we're still continuously updating our database, but we are predicting approximately a 20 to 30% drop in global flight training capacity. So even though in some countries we might have just a slight reduction in the number of flight schools, what we're seeing is that the infrastructure that those flight schools have has been significantly reduced. So they can also train a much smaller number of pilots than they did previously. They've reduced maybe the number of aircrafts that they have. They sold a couple of aircrafts which went into the general aviation market, maybe to private owners. Or they've reduced their staff number. So they've even this large number of schools which have survived the pandemic has reduced their capacity to train new pilots. And so we're still working on this data because it's quite a large data set. No one else in the world has done it before. It's quite difficult to get in the information. I mean, we've been doing it now for 2 years, but we would not be surprised to see a 20 to 30% drop in the global flight training capacity. So whereas the demand for pilots, the demand for airline pilots is going to increase quite rapidly again, we're still seeing a reduction in the global supply side of training new pilots. On the demand side as well, Airbus, for example, and Boeing, right, they've published their latest pilot and technician outlook, which in 2021 they revised slightly. But we're still looking at, the world, Boeing forecasting that the world needs 612,000 pilots over the next 20 years. And so we're really seeing this strong demand for pilots kind of still being there based on the order books. And what we're seeing as well is that the recovery in air travel has been a lot quicker than a lot of organizations, a lot of individuals were predicting. So as an example, once again, we've looked at things like the data published by IATA, which was kind of putting out predictions, and as you can see in March 2022, about how different regions would recover in terms of passenger numbers compared to their pre-pandemic passenger numbers. And over here, right, we're looking at kind of IATA's predicting a 2024 return to pre-pandemic levels, whereas we're starting to see already in certain domestic markets a really quick recovery in terms of the demand for air travel. And that is significantly affecting airlines. And I'll share that with you in a moment. So that's kind of some of the data that we've been working on, as you know, Hannah.
Yeah, thank you for that, Max. That's really insightful. Now on to my next question. How has the rapid recovery in air travel affected the demand for pilots by airlines?
So what we did over the past few weeks, we first looked at the global demand forecast put out by the large OEMs, by the leading organizations, to kind of get a picture of, okay, on a macro level, has there been a big change in terms of the number of pilots required, the forecast of the number of pilots being required over the next few years and over the next few decades. And there hasn't been much of a change, as I mentioned. We've then also looked at the recovery in terms of air travel, which really varies greatly by region, by domestic routes versus international routes. So it really varies. And especially what I want to emphasize, we're in April 2022, we're only around, let's call it 2 or 3 months out of the Omicron wave. So which had significant travel restrictions. So, everyone is only starting to slowly ramp up. But already now we've seen a significant effect on of how airlines are affected in terms of the demand for pilots. And so what we put together is really a timeline of how different airlines have made announcements about how their operations have been affected based on the demand for qualified and kind of current airline pilots that they have. So I just want to emphasize here that the terminology pilot shortage is quite broad, and I know there's an extremely large number of unemployed pilots still out there, and we like to do everything within our power to help pilots back into the cockpit as quickly as possible, and so that's why I just want to stress the term pilot shortage being used is sometimes used as well by different organizations or individuals within the industry, meaning that they just don't have enough current pilots on the line, ready for operations. So they might still be in training, or they might still be in the rehiring phase. So to give you an example, one of the leading global airlines I was speaking with recently told me that not only demand for air travel has picked up so quickly for them that when they tried getting more aircraft up in the air again to kind of cater to that demand, not only were they short current pilots on the line, current and qualified pilots on the line, but even to get there, right, they first had to rehire the pilots, but they had a shortage of recruiters to even rehire the pilots. And then even when they were rehired, they had a shortage of instructors to train the pilots and get them current before bringing them on the line. So it's not only this shortage of current on the line pilots, but it's also potentially a shortage in the instructors. And I'll share with you in a moment, just I think 2 or 3 days ago, we saw Southwest, one of the leading airlines in the US, make that announcement that they're short instructors. So what we did over the past few weeks is we've put together just a short timeline to show how the announcements by different airlines in terms of how their pilot demand was affecting operations. So really what we're seeing is quicker than expected return in air travel demand affecting operations. And this, once again, really varies greatly on a region by region and airline by airline and domestic versus international route dynamic. But we decided that from around end of December to now to kind of put together just like a brief timeline of the different announcements by airlines. So I think one of the most key moments was which occurred in the industry was already back in December 2021, when the US airline CEOs gave testimony to the US Congress that they were experiencing a pilot shortage, which was impacting their regional service in the US. Following and that is there's a great number of videos on YouTube. You can also find it on AFM.aero. I highly recommend for anyone listening to watch that. Then what we started seeing was already in January 2022, one of the new startup airlines in the US called Breeze Airways announced they would be significantly increasing their recruitment efforts in Australia. So in the US, they have a special visa program, the E3B, I think E3 visa program, where US airlines can hire Australian pilots under certain conditions. So, and it was quite interesting to see that Breeze Airways already made the announcement back in January that they would be increasing their recruitment efforts of Australian airline pilots. How that will impact Australia in the long term, we will see. We're already starting to see maybe the first few signs of it, but certainly something which will be interesting to watch. Following that, we saw Delta Airlines, also another one of the major airlines in the US, drop their bachelor requirements for new pilots. So once again, in order for them to kind of recruit a larger number of pilots to come onto the line. Following that, we saw in the US as well, regional airline Mesa Airlines, where the CEO was saying that the pilot shortage in the US has worsened. And once again, these are all headlines, which are all on AFM.aero. So if anyone goes onto our platform, they can go to our market intelligence section. They can go and click under the subsegment airline hiring, and they can see a lot of these different announcements. And what I'm sharing is just kind of the headlines, but these headlines on our platform then also have a lot more information contained to each of these headlines. Following that, Delta Airlines once again announced that they were planning to hire 200 pilots per month, and they were already starting to cut some of their regional flights. Following that, once again, Breeze Airways Vice President of Flight Operations shared their concern for their ability to grow due to pilot shortage. Following that, American Airlines, another one of the largest airlines in the US, stated that they were targeting to hire 70 pilots per week. So this just gives an indication of how large this initiative is in the US to kind of rehire pilots or hire new pilots to bring onto the line. Following that, in February 2022, SkyWest, which is the largest regional airline in the US, announced that they were seeing 5% of their total pilots being poached, and that they were starting to advertise for the recruitment of new pilots in airport terminals all over the US, even announcing a $40,000 bonus. Following that, SkyWest, once again, the largest regional carrier in the US, announced that they would be reducing their aircraft utilization block hours in 2022 by 10 to 15%, compared to, I believe it was 2021. So even though last year we still had the pandemic, this year, because there is so much demand from all of the different airlines in the US, some of the regional carriers, they're really seeing a large number of pilots leave those regional carriers, which in turn leads to them kind of reducing their routes or their aircraft utilization. Following these announcements, SkyWest's stock dropped by 22%, following these pilot shortage announcements. So it really had a huge effect on the airline. Following that, the Sun County CEO, which is another airline in the US, mentioned in an interview that they were predicting that in the US they're going to see much higher airfares due to the pilot shortage, and this is already back in February 2022. So this is really before the large increase in oil and the price of oil that we've seen now in kind of March and in April. And he made that statement in February 2022. If one looks at the airfares now in the US, especially over the last kind of 30 to 60 days, one can see that the price of airfares has doubled or tripled. Simply, it's not only because of the rise in fuel price, but it's simply because there's more demand for air travel than there is supply in terms of seats to cater to that air travel. So airfares are going up. Sun County, that same low-cost airline in the US, just announced yesterday that they would be stopping all their flights to Honolulu, Hawaii for the rest of the year due to not having enough pilots. Following that, in February 2022, once again, the Sun Country CEO said they were already seeing their maximum amount of operations that they could do due to the staff limitations that they were facing at that time. Following that, you had another two regional carriers in the US, Horizon Air and Raven Alaska, part of the same group, which announced their plans to quadruple the size of their recruitment department, simply because they were seeing that shortage of qualified crew. Following that, this is once again all still in February, Delta announced that it would be reducing its March flight schedule by 30,000 flights due to crew shortage. United Airlines, another carrier in the US, announced around the similar time that they would be reducing their March schedule by 10,000 flights due to crew shortage. And American Airlines around the same time announced that they would be reducing their flights in the March schedule by around 40,000 flights due to the pilot shortage. There's also been some regional airline CEOs, or specifically this Mesa Airline CEO in the US, which came out and in an interview or in a statement criticized the regulator in the US with the pilot shortage due to some of the restrictions and requirements that there are in the US. So a pilot needing, or a CPL holder needing 1,500 or around 1,500 hours, there's some certain conditions where they might need a bit less to get their ATP and to start flying with a regional carrier or with a commercial jet. And so we continued this mapping out this timeline in terms of announcements to almost where we are today. So we did it until last week. And I mean, almost on a day-by-day basis, we're seeing announcements of how airlines or carriers are being affected by by trying to adjust to this rapid recovery in air travel. So we continued looking at the announcement from February. Then we moved into March. In March, in the US, once again, Republic Airways announced that they would reduce their aircraft utilization by 6% in the second half of 2022 due to a pilot shortage. The CFO of Republic Airways, which is a regional airline in the US, stated that they predict that the peak pilot shortage in the US would be in the second half of 2023. And I think this is quite key for anyone listening, even in terms of what we're seeing. Right now, there is still a large number of pilots which are unemployed, but which are not current. So we also predict that for the next 6 months or so, 6 months, maybe until the end of the year, airlines are really focused on kind of rehiring as many pilots as they can. But what about after that? What about in 2023? Once everyone that has been rehired is, back on the line, kind of who is going to then come onto the line? Because for 2 years, flight schools have trained a lot less pilots. The majority of flight schools have trained a lot less pilots. Cadet pilot programs haven't been that active. So also from our side at AFM.aero, we are also predicting that kind of this mismatch between demand and supply we're really going to see quite significantly in 2023 and then going into 2024. So once again, in March, SkyWest Airlines, largest regional airline in the US, announced that they would be stopped serving 29 US regional cities. And then quite interestingly, we also had kind of the first commentary coming out of the UK, which mentioned that UK operators could face pilot shortage this year due to high retirements in 2021 and Brexit. So what we saw kind of in January, February, and March was a lot of announcements of how airline operations were affected by not having enough pilots on the line to cater to the demand in the US. But then what we're starting to see now is that starting to spread to different parts across the world. And April was really kind of the first month where we started seeing more announcement, more media coverage, more flight cancellations in different regions of the world. And I'll share with you kind of what we've seen so far. So beginning of April, after American Airlines had already announced in February that they would be reducing their flight schedule in March and April, then there was announcement that they would be pausing certain routes due to a pilot shortage. In April 2022, we then also saw quite interesting airlines in Vietnam become quite active again and launch really massive expat pilot recruitment campaigns, because Vietnam as well is starting to come out of the kind of Omicron wave and out of the pandemic. The airlines are ramping up again. And due to Vietnam not having a strong domestic pilot training infrastructure on the flight training side, there is still kind of a strong reliance on kind of recruiting pilots from all over the world to cater to the rapidly growing and the large order books that Vietnam Airlines have. Then in April as well, we saw United Airlines announcing that it was going to cut 17 routes due to pilot shortage. So once again, quite interesting. In February, those carriers announced reduction of their schedules in March. And then in April, we're starting to see US carriers really announce that they would be cutting routes due to the pilot shortage. Then as well in April, just a few weeks ago, we had in Canada. So we're starting to see the spread, or we're starting to see, let's call it not the pilot shortage spreading, but we're starting to see really demand for air travel pick up really rapidly in different parts of the world as we're coming out of Omicron and out of, the pandemic, hopefully. We started seeing an announcement by Canadian regional airline Pascan Aviation, which announced they are forced to reduce their schedule for peak tourist season due to pilot shortage. Now, just like to emphasize, Pascan Aviation relatively is a much smaller airline than some of the other airlines that we've mentioned previously, but it is still quite important to kind of track and note all of these announcements. Following that, there has been online coverage or media coverage that Horizon Air, one of the regional airlines in the US, was seeing a pilot attrition rate of 30% of all their pilots, which have been poached by other mostly major airlines in the US since the fall of 2021. In April as well, we had a number of airlines in the US announce that they would be increasing their hiring, their recruitment and hiring of Australian pilots under the E3 visa program. But then also quite interestingly, in April 2022, we had just last week, actually, or a week and a half ago, Qantas come out and I think the headline was Qantas sends SOS for pilots because they were experiencing the first days of flight deck crew shortage, both for captains and FOs. Now, that's not to say that there is not enough pilots in Australia, but that is just, that could be, this is what we believe, that retraining pilots again to get them current and get them on the line is not going as quick as how quickly demand has recovered for air travel. And so when we saw that headline, something that we've already been kind of studying is with all of these airlines in the US increasing their recruitment activities of captains and pilots, airline pilots from Australia, how is that going to affect the Australian market for the next few years? Are Australian carriers going to are Australian carriers going to see a crew shortage? So what we looked at as well is cadet programs. So the different cadet programs that the different airlines in Australia have and kind of what the status was of those cadet programs. We spoke with a couple of the different schools in Australia, which were seeing strong enrollment numbers again, and which believe that there will be a strong job market starting to ramp up. So once again, I would just like to emphasize, we're fully aware that there is an extremely large number of unemployed pilots out there. And so that's why when we show this term pilot shortage here, it is, us taking this from different statements from different airlines and different announcements. But what I think is currently being termed as a pilot shortage is not having enough current pilots on the line to satisfy the demand for operations that an airline could do based on the demand, based on the number of bookings that they're getting. As well, in the US, the United Airlines CEO announced that they have almost 100 airplanes grounded due to not having enough pilots. Once again, I would also like to emphasize that it could also be that they do not have enough pilots to fly these airlines, because pilots could also be out with sickness, so with COVID or something along those lines. So it is not necessarily just them not having enough current trained pilots. And then as well, we saw last week EasyJet and British Airways start canceling flights due to staff shortages. So it wasn't fully specified if this was due to only pilots or in general staff shortages, but we're starting to see different parts of the world, airlines in different parts of the world announce a reduction in, or announce the canceling of routes. And then in just last week as well, Southwest Airlines pilot report record levels of fatigue due to rapid rise in air travel. So this is something we need to closely watch as an industry over the next few years. JetBlue and Alaska, once again, very well-known US operators, announced a reduction of their summer schedule by up to 10% due to crew shortage. And then as well, just last week, we had, as I mentioned earlier, an instructor shortage forcing Southwest to slow down the hiring of new pilots, so them not being able to train enough pilots. And that's what we're seeing in a lot of different parts of the world. So a shortage of instructors, a shortage of simulator training capacity. And then actually, today we saw as well Sun County, which I mentioned earlier, announcing the stopping of flights to Honolulu for the rest of the year due to pilot shortage. We saw Hawaiian Airlines, which also canceled flights over the Easter weekend due to not having enough pilots. And then I think one quite interesting headline last week was American Airlines launching a bus service due to pilot shortage. So at least this is kind of what the announcement that we've seen within the industry, within the media, within the news. How much of it is due to pilot shortage? How much of it is due to just expanding their kind of network is something which needs to be studied in more detail. But this is what we're really seeing, that especially in the US, there is a really quick recovery in air travel. There is a huge demand for pilots by airlines, and the operators in the US, based on the announcements that we've seen, cannot keep up with how quickly the demand has risen again. And once again, we predict that to spread to different parts of the globe. We're already seeing it now. And so yeah, Hannah, as you know, this is some of the information of our market, of our larger market study that we've been working on over the past 2 weeks, and some of the information that we thought would be quite interesting to share with our audience.
Yeah, thank you, Max, for that. It's really great that you emphasize pilot shortage and what it could really mean to various organizations within the industry. And really interesting to see all these headlines, consolidated into like this kind of a report. Now, in terms of ab-initio pilot training, what are you seeing currently taking place?
So just like how we've kind of tracked the different announcements for how airline operations were affected by the demand for pilots across the world, we've done exactly the same for ab-initio programs. So we've once again created a timeline. I think it's back from around when we started seeing the first announcements towards the end of last year, the end of 2021, up until this point, and really have created a similar timeline to how I've just mentioned for the announcements by airlines in terms of a pilot demand. And that timeline we will publish on AFM.aero for all our premium members. So for anyone listening, if you're interested in this, I can only highly recommend signing up to AFM.aero. But to give everyone an overview, we are starting to see kind of some of the major airlines, some of the larger airlines reactivate the ab-initio pilot supply lines. And what we've seen so far as well, and what I want to share with everyone today, is kind of just a high-level overview, which is really large numbers that we've seen as well with some of the announcements that have already come out. The start of announcements for cadet programs really started off kind of late 2021, but really over the last 2 months, we've kind of seen a really steep uptick in terms of organizations, airlines reactivating the cadet programs or announcing their intention to reactivate their cadet programs. So especially over the last few months in March and April 2022, we've seen a number of organizations, a number of airlines announcing the reactivation of their programs, where they will start accepting applications kind of from this time or maybe from summer period, where the majority of operators are really starting their training in the second half of the year, of the ones which have already announced or which are starting to accept applications at this point. So once again, even the ones which have already started their restarted the ab-initio cadet programs or announced their intention to restart the ab-initio programs, once the actual training starts, the results of that will only be seen in, minimum of, let's say, 12 to 24 months, right? 1 to 2 years. So we're looking at like anyone who enrolls in training kind of this summer is going to, maybe be on the line in 2024. So this is why also we're predicting that 2023 is going to be a really interesting year for the global aviation industry in terms of will there be enough pilots to cater to the global demand for air travel. And what we're starting to see, especially over the past 2 months, there's been really large number of announcements in terms of reactivation of programs or airlines announcing their intention to reactivate their programs. And we just expect that that trend to continue and actually significantly increase by around Q3 2022, so Q3 this year, after kind of the summer travel period where kind of airlines are really going to, up until that period, they're really going to try and rehire as many as they can. And then they will see, okay, what is a lot of the demand in the summer kind of travel period in the Northern Hemisphere. And then following that, right, I think there will be a lot of organizations, a lot of airlines looking at, okay, how can they reactivate or put in place kind of supply lines to supply them with qualified pilots for their operations. And we at AFM.aero, when we look at this space, the whole industry kind of realized that 2018, 2019, especially 2019 was the year of cadet programs around the world. So an extremely large number of airlines, I think the largest number of airlines on record, launched dedicated cadet programs. So where there is almost a guarantee of a job completing the training. So the training is aligned to a specific operator. And then the pandemic happened and cadet programs kind of went, completely away. Like no airline knew kind of when they were going to need pilots again, and when they could, hire ab-initio pilots as well coming out of such programs. We at AFM.aero predict that 2023, we're going to see a lot more ab-initio cadet programs than in 2019, as airlines are looking to secure supply lines of pilots again. And as part of all of the cadet programs that we track and that we've put into our timeline, there's a couple which I want to share with everyone here, kind of key ones in the industry. So United Airlines launched their own pilot academy, or their own flight school. It started operations at the turn of 2021, 2022, and they announced that they are going to train and hire 5,000 new pilots from its own flight school. It's called United Aviate Academy. based in Phoenix, Arizona, US, by 2030, and hire another 5,000 new pilots from other flight schools by 2030. So huge number, right? 5,000 pilots. EasyJet, I think it was in March, if I'm not mistaken, also announced they are reactivating their cadet program, and they're going to recruit. They're going to recruit 1,000 trained pilots over the next 5 years from just one training provider, which is CAE. So they have an exclusive partnership. They're following an MPL program. So this is something quite interesting to see as well, because also in the pandemic, MPL programs there has been certain, let me see how to phrase this. There's been MPL programs have not necessarily been that great in the pandemic, and so quite a few airline cadet programs, MPL programs, also went through quite a turbulent time. And I think there's a lot of, unfortunately, there's a lot of individuals which really went through a tough time, or are still going through a tough time because of some of the global cadet programs and how they were structured. And I think a lot of that is still being looked into globally by the industry. And once again, as much as we can, we would like to help anyone affected. But EasyJet kind of making that announcement that they're going to hire 1,000 new pilots, which are to be trained by CAE under an MPL program, kind of shows their confidence in terms of the return of demand, air travel demand. And then we have Cathay Pacific, which just last month came out and launched the largest ab-initio cadet pilot program that in their history. So they're going to look to hire 800 pilots over the next 3 years, which are going to be trained by 2 training providers. And then as well, we have Ryanair, and a European, one of the European leading low-cost carriers, same as EasyJet, which has announced that they will be recruiting and hiring 500, that they will be hiring 500 trained pilots over the next 4 years from just one training provider, a flight school in France called Aston Fly. And on top of that, Ryanair has another 4 flight school partners. So, really what we're really seeing is a number of airlines are really now starting to kind of evaluate and seeing, okay, what is my CV stack in terms of pilots that I still have? Are there other airlines having the same CV stack, right? I remember that in the pandemic, speaking to a couple of different airlines, they were mentioning, oh, we have a CV stack of 6,000 pilots. But quite quickly, different airlines around the world have realized, based on what's happening in the US and really around the world, that it could be that, let's say, in a certain region, you have different airlines, and one is sitting on a CV stack of 6,000 pilots. Another one is also sitting on a CV stack of 6,000 pilots. So when one starts recruiting, that stack kind of goes down also for the other one as well. So no one really knows how many pilots have left the profession due to the pandemic. And I think airlines are starting to realize as well that it is going to be quite tricky or it's going to be quite expensive and tricky without their own cadet pilot program, because then they will have to hire from the open market, which is going to increase their cost of hiring and their cost of operation. And so they're starting to think about about implementing cadet programs again. Once again, anyone, if they implement it now, for them to get the pilots to come onto the line, where we're looking at a year and a half at a minimum, if not 2 years. So any decision made today is only potentially going to benefit airline operations 2 years down the road. So like I mentioned to you, Hannah, and I know we've been working on this quite closely, we, over the past few weeks, we've put together this timeline of ab-initio cadet programs as well. We have a couple of slides on that, the same timeline that I just shared in terms of how airlines also made their announcements. And what we're really seeing is, out of the over 5,000 airlines around the globe, there's really only a handful which have active cadet pilot programs again, and with the majority of them only becoming active in 2022. So just to give everyone an indication of all of the cadet programs that we found, which are either active or where they've made announcements that they were starting to be active again, fits on 3 slides. So, but quite small font size. So for anyone who's interested, please get in touch with us or become a member with AFM.aero, and that's the kind of information that we're publishing on our platform as well.
Yeah, thank you for sharing your insights with us today, Max. If anyone wants to learn more about our platform, please check out our website at AFM.aero or send us an email to info@afm.aero.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Hannah.
Thank you, Max.